physical existence itself is a paradox because we're always existing in two different levels at once. So if we attempt to leave the human behind and reach only for the divine, we're imbalanced. You cannot deny your humanity. The ego will use all of our newly gained spiritual wisdom to gaslight us, to create guilt in us, and we also will become hyper-judgmental towards other people for being unconscious. Every spiritual catalyst you experience in life is a paradox that you must solve. The Law of One describes spiritual balancing in many, many different ways. We're going to look at some of those quotes today from the Law of One. But Ra's always talking about this art of balancing the energy centers, balancing our spiritual energy. And so, we need to know what that really is, what that means, because in all the concepts of the Law of One, although they are very metaphysical, they're not just esoteric ideas. They are real living truths. They're discernible, understandable, ascertainable truths that we can grasp, but they are a bit deep, right? And they require a lot of reflection and contemplation. So spiritual balancing is, if I have to summarize it in the simplest way possible, let's begin with the idea that physical existence itself is a paradox because we're always existing in two different levels at once. And there's many ways we can define or describe these two levels, right? We have the physical and the non-physical. We have matter and space, form and consciousness, duality and non-duality, the human and the divine, the imperfect and the perfect, the temporal and the eternal, the finite and the infinite. And we are both of those polarities. We are both of those levels at the same time. And so spiritual balancing is getting at the heart of this paradox that although we appear to be two selves, lower self, higher self, human and divine, although we appear to be existing as two different selves, we're truly one self. There is no difference between the human and the divine. They are one, but they have to be experienced as two, because you can't experience anything without contrast. Yeah, white without black doesn't exist. Up without down doesn't exist. You cannot experience it. But as soon as you introduce black next to white, all of a sudden you understand what white is and what black is. As soon as you introduce up with down, now you understand what up really means and what down really means. So in that same way, the divine intelligence has created you as a with dual aspects to your nature, and that those dual aspects exist to be mirrors that reflect one another. You can only understand your divinity through your humanity, and you can only understand your humanity truly by understanding your divinity. And so Ra says, resting in this balanced awareness is the goal. So as long as a spiritual seeker, a spiritual adept, attempts to live only in one or the other level, and live in one and abandon the other, then there's always going to be an imbalance. And we do this unconsciously, unwittingly, without knowing that we're doing it. So here's my succinct definition for you, is that spiritual balancing is the art of resolving paradoxes within oneself. Every thought, every experience, every emotion is a paradox of sorts, because it contains a dual nature, right? The relative and the absolute. Two perspectives, right? You could say spiritual balancing is the art of resolving paradoxical perspectives together within yourself, right? Through meditation and contemplation and introspection. Understanding how the divine and the human are both equally valid in every experience. So I'm gonna look at a PowerPoint today to kind of show you and walk you through this, not only what spiritual balancing is, but how we do it. But the important point I want to make is that let me back up. The reason spiritual balancing is so important is because if we attempt to, let's say, only do shadow work, We're only living in the human, the egoic perspective. We're just doing shadow work all the time. And we never bring in the absolute perspective to that shadow work, then true healing cannot take place because, we're living in only one perspective. If we only continue to love our pain, but we never come to realize why our pain was based on a false viewpoint, then we'll continue recreating that pain, right? And this is the archetype of the perpetual shadow worker. Somebody who's just always doing shadow work, and they never seem to get to the end of it. I've used that analogy of the flooded house. Shadow work is feminine healing, gross purification. And if a house is flooded with water, the feminine healing, the shadow work, the gross purification, is the opening of all the windows and doors. So let all that accumulated energy flood out of the house. But if we only do that and we don't turn off all the faucets in the house, which is the masculine healing, subtle purification, then that water's going to reaccumulate, right? Because we have a wrong perspective of who we are. We have a wrong understanding of who I am, and that wrong understanding will continue to create distortions. So we have to keep doing shadow work. So that's what happens if we get stuck in the human perspective and never bring in the divine perspective. But let's look at this side now. What happens if we get stuck in studying non-duality obsessively? Now, disclaimer, you guys know my stance on non-duality. Non-duality is absolutely valid and absolutely true in every way. But where non-duality tends to go wrong, and really more so Neo-Advaita, is that it attempts to completely deny the relative perspective, the human perspective, and only adhere to the absolute perspective, the non-dual perspective. That is, it exalts wisdom and denies love. And this is this creates the spiritual narcissist archetype. Somebody who's been really fattened up with spiritual concepts, and they think they understand everything. They think that they know spiritual truth, and so, there's nobody here. There's nobody suffering. Why are you crying? What is there to suffer from? There's only this. There's only this. And these kind of like non-duality slogans get tossed around as a means of avoiding and bypassing what is happening on the relative perspective, which is, yes, there is only reality, there is only oneness, but oneness is pretending to be separateness, a person, an individual, and it's suffering greatly. So we have to take that perspective also into account and merge it with the absolute perspective. So we need love for the human and we need wisdom for the divine. And we need to balance love with wisdom, yeah? And Ra says that perfect balancing of love and wisdom doesn't even happen until the sixth density. So it's not as easy of a task as it may sound, right? But in this density level, our purpose is just to learn the lessons of love. We're just really here to learn how to love the human, love the egoic self and forgive it and accept it as it is so that we can finally begin to understand our divinity. So understanding the lessons of love is the most important goal of a third density lifetime, which we're all living. But once we do that, to continue progressing, we need to start bringing in that wisdom to balance things out. So this is why clinging only to the absolute perspective, the divine perspective, and pretending like you're not still a human is not actually enlightened. It'd be kind of like a software engineer creating a web page, right? On the back end of the web page, it's all just thousands of lines of coding, right? Zeros and ones. It's all binary. But on the front end of the web page, it's this beautiful artistic design, right? This website with writing and pictures and tabs and buttons and videos razzle-dazzling you, right? So would it make any sense for a software engineer to say, this website doesn't exist. There's nothing really there at all. It's all an illusion. It's just zeros and ones. It's like, well, that's true, but isn't the purpose of all those zeros and ones to create the web page that looks beautiful and functions well? Aha, so the front end is as valid as the back end. One isn't more valid than another because really, they are one. What do a bunch of zeros and ones mean on a piece of ledger? It's meaningless. There's no beauty to it. It's dry. It's tasteless. It only has beauty and meaning when we see what it does on the front end, which is the website, the videos, the text, the colors, the artistry. All those zeros and ones are meant to create this divine design. And that's what God has done in the universe. God, the absolute, the eternal, the non-dual, has created the finite, the temporal, the form, the human. And so that is also divine because the human is what the divine is doing. The relative is what the absolute is doing. So to deny the relative and say, it's just an illusion, doesn't exist, forget about it, there's no person, there's nothing happening, there's only oneness. That is a true perspective, but if you don't balance it with the relative, say, yes, but nevertheless, I am also a human being named Aaron who is going through life with emotions, challenges, catalysts, and so I need to also be there. Because is God an idiot who made an accidental physical universe and is stuck in God's dream on accident and it's just God's trying to deny it and get out of it? Nope. God doesn't make mistakes. The universe of form is a divine design in the mind of God. It's a divine idea in the mind of God through which God is knowing itself, which makes it holy and sacred. It's not eternal. It's not infinite, it is finite, but that's beautiful, and that's what gives it purpose and meaning, yeah? That's the stage upon which the soul can act and play and know itself. So if we attempt to leave the human behind and reach only for the divine, we're imbalanced. And we're weaponizing the spiritual ego enormously. That's the spiritual narcissist, right? The ego will use all of our newly gained spiritual wisdom to gaslight us, to create guilt in us, I don't measure up to my knowledge, to cause us to bypass our feelings. Well, there's no one here, there's no one really feeling anything. We'll use these non-dual platitudes to bypass what's actually arising in this moment. And we also will become hyper-judgmental towards other people for being unconscious. Don't they know that their ego is unreal? Why are they so stuck in this false point of view? They should be enlightened like I am. You know, we can get really imbalanced if we're trying to cling to the non-dual perspective only. All of our unhealed distortions will rage like a fire in the wind, growing hotter and hotter within us because we tried to abandon them and go over to the divine perspective. Screw the human perspective, it only causes me suffering, I hate it, I don't like it, somebody save me. Oh, non-duality says nothing is real. Oh, that sounds good. Okay, I'm just nothingness, I'm just awareness, I'm just oneness. You are also still a human being and you cannot escape it in this life. Stop trying to escape it and start embracing it. Love is not a dismissal or a denial of anything. Love does not move away from anything. Love is a forward movement. Love embraces, love moves towards. So we can't leave the human, we can only move towards it and embrace it and welcome it into the heart space with unconditional love. And then, transmutation takes place. Once the human is finally loved in its true essence, we realize, the human is the divine. The person is what God is doing. As Jesus said, I and my Father are one. I am a ray of light coming from the sun. The absolute and relative are the same. There's one single, indivisible reality that has pretended to split itself off into absolute and relative. But it's just a play. It's just Maya. There is no non-duality or duality. The absolute is beyond those definitions, right? So if we attempt to leave the human behind, those unhealed distortions we're trying to leave behind will burn within us hotter and hotter, burning us from the inside out, literally, while we attempt to ignore them and repeat non-duality slogans like, no, there's only this, there's only the present moment, there's no pain, there's no one to feel pain, there's no person. I mean, guys, I did that for years. I tried that perspective out, and that perspective can work if it's also being taken into equal consideration with the feminine, the shadow work, the meeting of the humanity of what you are. So I don't want to belabor this too much before we get into our PowerPoint. So let me share my screen with you guys and take you through a quick review of spiritual balancing from the Law of One. So this is a quote from session 57. You've heard me quote this one a lot. Ra says, "The seeker seeks the one. The one is beyond duality and non-duality," right? This one is to be sought, as we have said, by the balanced and self-accepting self, aware of both its apparent distortions and its total perfection. Resting in this balanced awareness, the entity then opens the self to the universe which it is. The light energy of all things may then be attracted by this intense seeking, and wherever the inner seeking meets the attracted cosmic prana, realization of the one takes place. So I want to show you this dichotomy here through the energy centers. This is the SQ chart we've seen many, many times. Let's look at this dichotomy that Ra just laid out here. So we have the human, the lower three chakras, and then we have the divine, the upper three chakras. We have duality in the lower three. We have non-duality in the upper three. We have our apparent distortions in the lower three chakras. And we have our total perfection in the upper three chakras. We have the relative perspective in the lower three chakras and the absolute perspective. So the goal is not to leave the lower three chakras and abandon them to get up into the upper three. We never leave anything behind. We never move away from anything, right? Because love is a forward movement. So we're moving towards our humanity, we're moving towards our duality, we're moving towards our apparent distortions, we're moving towards the relative perspective, and then balancing it with the divine perspective, with our total perfection, with non-duality, with the absolute perspective. And that, my friends, only happens in the heart. You see how the heart is the point of contact between the human and the divine. The heart is where both dual natures are welcomed equally, with mutual acceptance. The heart is the meeting place of our duality with our non-duality. So that is the spiritual balancing in a nutshell. Spiritual balancing is welcoming both aspects of who we are equally into the heart, not trying to delete one in favor of the other or escape one and chase after the other, but make them equals, right? Equal dance partners. And this is symbolized in the Taoist symbol of yin and yang. The yin yang represents spiritual balance, where light and dark are both met with equal proportion. So, moving forward, so Dawn is asking, it says here it would seem the proper balancing exercises for all the sensations of the body would be some form of inactivity, such as meditation or contemplation. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is largely incorrect. The balancing requires a meditative state in order for the work to be done. So that's an important statement there, and we're gonna go back to this a lot. It does require a meditative state. However, the balancing of sensations, that's feelings, emotions, pain, thoughts, the balancing of sensations has to do with an analysis of the sensation with a special respect to any unbalanced leaning between the love and the wisdom, or the positive and the negative. Then whatever is lacking in the balanced sensation is, as in all balancing, allowed to come into the being after the sensation is remembered and recalled in such detail as to overwhelm the senses. So this is what we really pinpoint in the student ascension curriculum. In our first course, Module 8 goes into spiritual balancing, and we learn this idea of, if you are feeling anger, as per Ra's example, you have to meet that human part of you with full acceptance. So hey, if the human wants to be angry, let it be angry, let it rip. But try to do it in mind alone, because mind is the, let's see, what's the word I want to use here? mind is the back end, let's say. Mind is the playground of imagination where we get to decide what we want to actually do and play out in the physical, in the front end. So it's much better to let the anger play out in the back end rather than in the front end. Meaning it's better to just feel the anger mentally and imagine yourself punching a hole through that wall, kicking over that chair or whatever, than to actually do it physically. Now, if you do it physically, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But it is giving the ego a little more power to act through you, right? It's coming into agreement with the ego's thought system. And so we want to let the ego's thought system have its say. And as Ra says, we'll then be able to see the folly of it. Meaning when we imagine ourselves acting out our anger, screaming at somebody, red in the face, veins on our neck, we'll kind of have this moment of recognition of like, I think I actually don't want to do that. And a little bit of wisdom will be able to come in, right? Now we're bringing in the opposite perspective. What if I acted with total equanimity and forgiveness? And you imagine, what would it be like if I were, let's say, the Buddha, and I could respond to this person's rude behavior with total peace, balance, and compassion? And you imagine doing that, and you say, oh, that actually feels more in alignment with what I really want. So we have not denied the relative perspective. We have not rebuked our anger. We allowed ourselves to feel our anger. But we did also, in feeling it, allow ourselves to see the foolishness of it, that it doesn't actually lead us to where we want to go. And then we bring in the divine perspective and realize, that's actually what I'm looking for. So both have been given their stage and come into equal validity in our awareness. And then the decision makes itself from there, based upon wisdom. So here's a little fun picture of the imbalance of perspectives that can happen. So before spiritual awakening, this is where we are on this kind of teeter-totter between the human and divine perspectives. We're only living in the human perspective. I'm a separate person, I'm an ego with all these traumas and rejection and abandonment and abuse, and poor me, I'm a victim. And then we start to come into a spiritual awakening, and it feels amazing. We're in love with life and the universe, and we realize, wow, I'm something more than just that person. What good news that is. But the tendency is that we love the divine perspective so much that we try to use it as a hiding place from the human perspective. Right? We haven't really gone back to the human perspective with our new illumination, with our divine perspective, and said, hey, it's okay that you feel that way. It's okay that you suffer. All of your pain is valid. It's okay to feel what you feel. You are still divine. We haven't done that yet, and so it begins to lead to imbalance. We're trying to get away from the human perspective and stay in the divine perspective. But as almost all of us have realized by now, this doesn't work. Right? You cannot deny your humanity. You must exalt your humanity into your divinity. So at a certain point of imbalance, continual imbalance, we will eventually hit the dark night of the soul. We'll be trying to cling desperately to the divine perspective, and yet it just doesn't seem to work. We don't feel it. We don't really believe it deep down. All of these traumas are still coming up. We still feel unfulfilled. All of these things are surfacing at the same time because, again, we haven't actually dealt with them yet. We just tried to run away from them to a higher perspective. So we don't need to abandon the higher perspective and go back into the lower perspective. We need to bring the higher perspective with us back into the lower perspective. We need to bring that divine perspective back to the human. And so for a while, it looks like this. This is called shadow work, right? We have to be loving towards our humanness. We have to be willing to feel those things that the human feels. Nobody loves me. I'm rejected. I'm abandoned. I'm never going to be good enough. I'll never live up to anything. All of these dark thoughts and beliefs have to be met with love, right? Unconditional love. And so for a while, we have to be able to hold that space of looking at our humanity from our divinity at the same time. But then as we continually balance our two dual natures like this, we reach a state of balance. And so that balance only happens, again, from the heart space. All right, we've brought our humanity and our divinity into the heart, such that now we're not seeing either side of the teeter-totter as being more or less valid than the other. We realize that our divinity we're only able to know it because we're being a human being. We're only able to understand the absolute because we're looking at it from the relative. We're only able to understand non-duality because we're looking at it through duality. We're only able to understand our total perfection through our apparent distortions. So this here is the eternal, right? This is what never changes about us. This is who you were before you came into incarnation, and this is what you will always be. But nevertheless, this is the mirror through which we know that side. This is the reflection that gives us the ability to know our divinity. And isn't that beautiful and divine and worth loving? Isn't God doing something amazing through you, the human being? And isn't the human being a marvelous design of intelligence and beauty and wonder? It's all divine, right? So in that sense, even though this is finite and temporal, impermanent, it is to be loved as equally as the divine, yeah? And so you rest in the middle, in that balanced center. The divine perspective is attained through wisdom, right? This is what non-duality attempts to do, is use wisdom to reach enlightenment, to understand the nature of reality. So we need wisdom. But non-duality by itself tends to be totally devoid of love because it denies the human perspective. There's nothing to love because it's not even real. It's to be ignored, to be forgotten about. And so we need also the love for the humanness, for our humanity. And this is the crux of balancing. It's always a balance of love and wisdom. And we're going to get into the 3-step kind of process. Last quote. This is the quote about anger I was mentioning. Just wanted to read it for context. Ra says, "This entity, if using the catalyst mentally, blesses and loves the anger in itself. It then intensifies this anger consciously in mind alone, until the folly of this red ray energy is perceived not as folly in itself, but as energy subject to spiritual entropy due to the randomness of energy being used." So Ra is saying anger is not invalid or bad, it's just that it's a very chaotic energy pattern. It's a very chaotic vibration. It doesn't have harmony or organization to it, and so it's kind of like a bomb or something. It's going to destroy anything in its vicinity. It's going to cause entropy and chaos all around it. So that also has a place in the universe, but you do need to see the nature of the energy you're dealing with, right? Anger will truly not lead you anywhere you want to go, but you've got to see that in yourself. You can't take my word for it. You can't take Ra's word for it. You've got to go within, right? When you feel that anger boiling up inside, you've got to sit with that anger and say, all right, anger, you want to express? Let's go, baby. What do you want to do? And you just imagine that anger in its full might, full strength, screaming, raging, kicking glass doors open, punching the wall, slashing tires. You know, you go through the whole gamut of whatever the mind wants to do. And you'll see when you allow the mind free expression of that anger, you will have that awareness of, oh yeah, I definitely don't want to do that. But if you don't let yourself imagine it, if you don't let yourself visualize where that anger wants to carry you, guess what? It's going to hijack your body and do it anyways. It's going to hijack your physical vehicle and act itself out. Why? Because you haven't given that anger a place of expression. So because the universe is mental, the first Hermetic principle, right? The universe is mental. Then everything can be done mentally. So you can act out mentally what that anger wants to do, get it out of your system, and then you have the awareness to say, oh yeah, I certainly don't want to act out this anger. There must be a better way. And then you can bring the opposite perspective in. Positive orientation then provides the will and faith to continue this mentally intense experience of letting the anger be understood, accepted, and integrated with the mind-body-spirit complex. The other self, which is the object of anger, is thus transformed into an object of acceptance, understanding, and accommodation, all being reintegrated using the great energy with which anger began. And then this last quote here I thought was interesting. Ra says, "Control is the key to negatively polarized use of catalyst. Acceptance is the key to positively polarized use of catalyst." So that's another easy litmus test, right? Of, is my ego, my mind, trying to use this emotion to control somebody, to get my way, to manipulate the situation? And when someone's acting out a fit of rage, screaming at someone, maybe even hurting someone, they're definitely trying to control that person. They're trying to subdue them, right? And dominate them. So positive use of catalyst must always look the opposite. Yeah, it has to come to a full acceptance of what I'm feeling, such that I can allow my mind to act it out and imagine it. But because I love all beings as equal with myself, I will never take my anger out on another being, because then I start to move to the negative polarity. So neither is right or wrong. It's just about, what do you want? Do you want to polarize to the positive? Well, then make sure you never allow the ego to use your anger to control people, to hurt people, to abuse people. Make sure you let it play itself out mentally, but balance it with the positive perspective, the divine perspective. So let's talk about how to do that. So step number 1 of spiritual balancing, find the imbalance. The imbalance may be through a thought, through a feeling, or through an action. And here in 40 University, we talk a lot about contraction versus expansion, right? If I feel contracted in my state of being, I know for sure I have an imbalance. So that may be a feeling of contraction. I may even notice a thought before the feeling comes. I may notice a thought of resistance or something. Or I may watch my body actually acting out an imbalance. Bragging, judging, criticizing, making fun of someone, being in a fear state. Wherever you find the imbalance, just notice it. Bring it into awareness. Observe where the imbalance is taking place. That's an obvious step number 1. Step number 2 is discover which perspective you are overbalanced in. That is relative or absolute. And we talked a lot about this, right? Are you too stuck in the human perspective? Well, then you need the divine perspective. Yeah? Somebody who hasn't started their spiritual awakening yet, who may have never even heard of the concept of oneness yet, what do they need? They need to hear about oneness. They need to hear, hey, you're something more than just your body. But if you've been on a spiritual path for 3 to 5 years, you probably need more of that human perspective now, right? Because you've been really immersing yourself in the divine perspective, which is very good. But kind of like the prodigal son or something, we have to eventually return home again with this newly gained wisdom. And so we need to bring that divine perspective back to our humanness, right? So realize which perspective you're overbalanced in, relative or absolute. If you're stuck in the relative perspective, the human or the ego, then as we said, turn it up to its furthest conclusion until you're able to see that this perspective is folly. So whatever the ego wants, whatever fit of rage it's in, whatever fear state it's in, mentally, in a meditative state, allow yourself to go through that entire experience. Act it out in your mind to its furthest conclusion. Because what you're trying to do is to, again, give yourself the context to see that the ego's perspective is always foolish. It is always against its own best interest. A Course in Miracles says, the ego is your own energy used against you. So you want to see how giving into the ego's perspective will be used against you, right? It will hurt you in the end. When you act out angrily, we know very bad consequences follow. Maybe a little more subtly, when you constantly act in a fear state, a state of anxiety or stress, very bad consequences will follow. Likewise with sadness and depression. So you have to see that you don't actually want that perspective, although you're allowing it equal footing to express itself. If you are stuck in the absolute perspective, which happens after many years on a spiritual path, remind yourself that the divine only finds expression through the human, and so the human is to be honored as equally valid. That's the one thing we have to remind ourselves of if we're really stuck in spiritual concepts all the time, bypassing, gaslighting ourselves. Well, you're not really angry because there's no person to be angry and blah, blah, blah. You need to bring that back to your humanity and say, no, I'm not denying my human's anger anymore. The human is also divine. It's a valid perspective. It's the way God knows itself. So cry if you must cry. Scream if you must scream. Don't censor yourself with non-duality concepts. That's a little bit more difficult in some ways than the relative perspective because it requires more nuance, right? You got to hold those two perspectives equally. And the ego is the dividing mind, right? It wants to make one perspective invalid and the other valid. It wants to make one perspective good and the other bad. So if you spend a lot of time reading spiritual books, you'll watch your spiritual ego try to invalidate your humanity. Oh, you shouldn't be feeling this way. You know better. Oh, you shouldn't have had a judgmental thought just now. You've read the Course in Miracles. You know you're not supposed to judge. Guilt tripping, bypassing, gaslighting. This is what the spiritual ego will do to us if we're not willing to meet our humanity to the fullest. So, cry, scream into a pillow, move the energy mentally, whatever it takes to not censor yourself with a spiritual concept. That's the basic balancing act we need if we're stuck in the absolute perspective too much. Finally, the third step Ra touches on is to bring to mind, or imagination, the opposite perspective, and then welcome it as equally valid. So if you, again, have a fit of rage, have the fit of rage mentally, and then imagine being untouchable. Imagine what it would be like if your self-knowledge, your self-love was so great that that person could say any comment to you. They could insult your mom, they could insult your clothes, your face, your hair. They could say that you're stupid. They could say that you're untalented. It doesn't matter. Nothing they could ever say to you would move you from your peace. And you would just look at them with compassion and understanding. Literally imagine it. Get yourself into that visualization of, if my highest self were actualized, how would I have then handled that situation? Maybe I got triggered and upset, but what if I was fully self-actualized? What would that have looked like? And welcome that as also equally valid. And so when you do that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. You're achieving that yin-yang symbol, where both polarities are equally balanced and you have resolved that paradox in yourself. What paradox? The paradox of being both a human and an eternal spirit at the same time. The paradox of being an ego and being God. That's the paradox we have to constantly solve within ourselves. And so, just for some practical application, you should have a vibrant inner life, you guys. You should live your day in such a way that you're always being aware of yourself. You're always observing every thought and action for imbalances which may need correction. You should be just naturally using every situation to balance yourself more by watching when the ego pops out. Oh, there was a selfish comment. There was a rude comment. There was an impatient comment. And no guilt whatsoever. Let's just balance it. So you bring to mind, what if I was so patient it didn't even cross my mind to say that? And you can say, that feels really good. So it's okay that I was impatient, but what I really want is to be patient. That's balance. We're not invalidating any perspective. We're just realizing what we want. So you should be using every situation to reach that balance of love and wisdom. Spiritual balancing is not a practice that you only do when you're in trouble. And this is often when we get questions about spiritual balancing. It's like, hey, so I had this huge burst of rage yesterday, and I tried to do spiritual balancing, but I couldn't really figure it out. It was really hard. And that's because it really isn't a practice you're supposed to only use when you're in big trouble, when the volcano has erupted, so to speak. It's something you're supposed to be doing with even the subtlest things. You just notice a little bit of impatience. I was doing this the other day. We went to dinner with Selena's mom and stepdad, and they really like to hang out at restaurants for a long time, and they'll order like we'll eat food, and then they'll just keep ordering like 2 to 3 more rounds of drinks. And they stay up later than we do and stuff. So, we'd been there since like 6:30, and it was, 10 o'clock, 10:15. And I noticed my mind getting really impatient and kind of like, I don't want to be here anymore. And so I was like, there's some impatience. Let's balance it. And I just went inside for a moment and just imagine, what if I was so at peace with the present moment that the idea of I don't want to be here never arose? What if I could be just as happy here as anywhere else? And this warmth kind of was felt in the heart space of like, that's what I want. And so I didn't guilt trip myself for being impatient. I just noticed it and brought it into awareness and balanced it. That's one example of how this can happen in even the subtlest situations. So it's not a practice you do when things are going wrong, really, really wrong. It's a practice that you do as an ongoing lifestyle, happening all throughout your day. And the final caveat is we don't need to be obsessive about this either. I don't want to say all of this and have you say, okay, I got to watch my mind all day and balance all day long. It's going to happen naturally. Yeah, if you want to balance, you're going to be balancing. If you want to reach balance, it's going to start happening. But just live your life in such a way that there's great mindfulness about your activity. When a little contraction is felt, you just say, there's some imbalance here. Where's the imbalance? Step number 1. And then maybe you find that it's an imbalance in the relative perspective, the human perspective. You're a little bit, high on your horse. You're feeling a bit prideful or something. And so you say, okay, let's bring in the divine perspective. And you imagine what it would be like to walk with total humility in this moment. What if I didn't need to brag about myself to my friends right now? What if I didn't need constant validation, but I could just radiate love and listen and be present with them? And you imagine that most enlightened version of yourself, and then the natural recognition in the heart takes place. That is what I want. That is the higher way. And so now we're bringing our humanity into our divinity, right? We're not leaving it behind for our divinity. We're exalting the human to the divine. That's balancing. That's the resolution of the paradox of having dual natures, relative and absolute. Every spiritual catalyst you experience in life is a paradox that you must solve. Every lesson that life brings you, we call it a catalyst. We do catalyst integration every first of the month. Every catalyst you experience is actually like a divine riddle, a divine paradox being presented to you, because the universe of form is dual, it's duality, it's polarity. So there's a dual nature to every catalyst. There's a human nature to it, and there's a divine nature to it. So we meet the human first and say, it's okay that I feel what I feel. I love my resentment. I love my bitterness. It's just an expression of wrong understanding. It's my emotional guidance system trying to tell me that I have a false thinking at play in my mind. So thank you, feeling of resentment, for warning me about an incorrect perception. Thank you, feeling of bitterness, for sounding the alarm that I've strayed away from the truth. You are also divine and welcome in my presence. And you let the human feel what it feels. And if there's a lot of emotions, go get somewhere alone, get into a meditative state, turn that baby up. Let it go, let it fly, cry into the pillow, scream into the pillow. Let the human have its moment. And when you do that, you're draining that energy out of the body, out of the house, right? Gross purification. And then once you've exhausted that human perspective, much like a child throwing a temper tantrum or something, then as you're resting in that space now, you now bring in the divine perspective. What if I walked on air and that didn't even touch me? What if I had so much love in my heart that I couldn't even feel a judgment towards that person, but I just felt understanding for their pain? What if I was able, instead of getting triggered and taking things personally, to actually feel into the energy behind that person's words and realize that's a hurting person. They said that rude thing because they're full of rudeness. They're full of pain. They're rude to themselves. And what if I felt warm compassion? And what if in my compassion, that person was taken aback and surprised, astonished that I didn't give in to their attack, and I instead leaned in and said, well, tell me more about that. And then, boom, depolarization right away. Amazing, isn't it? When someone meets you with anger and accusation, and you open up to them, oh, I'm so sorry, tell me more about that. If I've done something wrong, I want to know, and I want to apologize to you for it. Immediately, even the greatest psychopath gets depolarized in their energy. Oh, okay, well, here's what I feel like happened. And you just keep leaning in, you keep leaning in. Love is a forward movement. And after leaning in enough, they feel your energy that you don't want to be their enemy. You don't want to be in conflict. You want unity with them. You want love and peace with them. And that's really what they want too, in their innermost depths, right? So you could walk yourself through that entire visualization I just articulated. If you got into a conflict with somebody, go back and rehearse it from your most enlightened perspective. The most enlightened version of you, walk that version of you through that catalyst and see what they would do. And as you continue to do that, you want to talk about qualifying your energy, guys? Imagining the most enlightened version of yourself going through any situation is a powerful way of qualifying your energy towards enlightenment, towards illumination, towards love. Imagination is the vehicle for conscious creation. So if you never think about what would I do if I was enlightened, you know what I mean? Then how could you ever create that version of yourself? You're the creator. So create that version of yourself in your mind, in your imagination. But don't do it at the detriment of your humanness, right? Don't try to ignore and push out what you really feel inside so you can get an enlightened perspective. First, acknowledge what you feel inside. Welcome it into the heart space. You are also welcome here, bitterness. And then, after that plays itself out, it's been loved and accepted, now let's bring in that enlightened perspective, that divine perspective, that absolute perspective, where in reality, there are no problems. There's only perfection. So how can there be a problem appearing beside perfection? It's a paradox. You got to resolve it in yourself. And that's the art of spiritual balancing.